We're at Inside Bitcoin's NYC. I'm Perianne Boring with Money and Tech, and I'm joined by James D'Angelo of the World Bitcoin Network, which is a YouTube channel. So it has about 10,000 subscribers. So what are some of the themes you cover on your channel?
I don't try and cover sort of the daily news, so I try and look at where people are having troubles coding. So I did a full code of multi-signature wallets, or people didn't understand Merkle roots, so I did a full thing on Merkle roots. But I try and look at more esoteric things too, sort of how the lack of SEC's involvement might hide volatility issues, right? It's actually a very predictable set of volatility for the first 5 years of a non-private company.
Can you elaborate more on the volatility that you say the SEC is hiding?
Well, sure. If you're Facebook, right, or if you're Google or you're Twitter, the first 5 years traditionally for a tech type thing is private. So you're protected. Well, you're not protected. You're actually prevented from accepting any amount of investment. So the investors can only be the very rich ones. We get Peter Thiel over and over again. He looks like a... Sorry?
Your institutional investors.
Right, who are vetted by the SEC. So Mark Zuckerberg in his dorm room, if you thought Facebook was a good idea, you couldn't hand him $20. You'd go, look, I can't accept that. His first investment was $12 million, right? That's private investment. Public can invest as much as they want, but that's 5 years. The volatility of these things, guarantee you Facebook wasn't just a upward little curve up into 18 billion. As MySpace made announcements, other people, the price was fluctuating dramatically. So,
last week, the U.S. House Committee on Small Businesses, they had a hearing on the risk of Bitcoin and the regulatory issues behind it. And one of the themes there was the volatility of Bitcoin. And one of the witnesses said that the reason that he believes Bitcoin is a bubble is because of the volatility. What are your comments on that?
yeah, I mean, I just think that's bugged. That shows no sort of history of how these things take off. You're telling me Facebook actually had real value on day one? You know, it didn't. Twitter, up until their South by Southwest conference, they were probably arguing all the time and thinking of disbanding. Volatility for them was very high just emotionally. They had no value. Bitcoin is just made that whole process of being private made public for the first time. So SEC would love to get their claws in there, but they can't even figure out what it is.
Well, I was introduced to Bitcoin by the Jobs Act. I worked for on Capitol Hill for a member of the House of Representatives, and I first heard about Bitcoin through the Jobs Act, which changes the rules for accredited investors. How do you think the Jobs Act has affected Bitcoin, and do you think there needs to be more work outside of the Jobs Act?
You've gone over my head. I'm not familiar with that at all. I do think that volatility is not a real issue. I think this is a modern thing. So if you conceive of a currency 200 years ago before iPhones, volatility is a major issue, right? You can't, if you don't know the price of something when you're going to use it, it's a real problem. But we can have all our wallets designated only in something someone's familiar with, dollars, gold, euros. The back end, we can slide around Bitcoins all we want at any volatility, which is what most of these companies are doing right now. We see BitPay do that quite well, and volatility is just not an issue for the merchant.
And we see volatility within all currencies, but Bitcoin has extreme volatility. Why do you think that is?
Babies scream. They make lots of noise. As they get older, they get quieter. We're talking about a baby that's still screaming for his diaper change and all that. It's massive volatility. It's going to settle. It's not going to settle this year or next year. And none of these ideas that we're talking about that will claim to settle volatility are going to do that. We're going to see massive volatility for 5 more years. I think it's fun. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy. So in 2009, when Bitcoin was first unleashed, its annualized volatility was about 160%, just to get a perspective on it. Now it's about 140%, which is still 7 times more risky than the Argentinian peso, which obviously there's a lot of volatility there too. But do you think that it's just because it's thinly traded, and you think this will level out as Bitcoin becomes more widely accepted?
I agree with you. I think there's a lot to do with the fact that it's thinly traded. But remember, the government, indeed the Fed, tries to limit the volatility. So they do a lot of preventative measures. No one's doing that with Bitcoin, and no one will successfully do that with Bitcoin. I think we have to just be prepared for the fact that volatility is not the end-all statement for a currency like we used to think it was, and we're going to have to live with a little bit of it. It's not going to stay as high as it's been. It's going to get less and less, as it has for 5 years, but for another 10 years, we're talking get ready to enjoy the slopes, the moguls of life.
All right, now let's talk a little bit of theory here. Now, Milton Friedman predicted eCash in 1999. There's a video, I guess you've seen it. Do you think Bitcoin or Milton Friedman knew about Bitcoin, or he was just ahead of his time? Or, I mean, he was the person that said that computers should replace the Fed. So do you think he was just above his time at this point?
I think that the idea of digital cash is not new. So he was actually talking at a time when other people were looking at doing this very thing, and they actually saw the provocative and alluring potential that something like this might have. Satoshi was actually on the later end, right? IBM was involved in trying to form a digital currency. A lot of other people were looking at these ideas. So he was part of a group of people who were just ahead of their time thinking about this. But there's an author, Neil something, wrote Cryptomicon like the same year, and he alludes to a very similar idea. He's not the only one. I think they're predecessed by a good 15 years by another economist who talks about how you can create digital currency and what that would mean. They all understand that you don't need intrinsic value for a currency, right? We talk about volatility, intrinsic value, all these cliches that people use. Go back to school, Bitcoin will give you a new schooling, and you'll understand that currency doesn't mean what we thought it is meant.
And everything is going online, commerce, government procedures, and now we're seeing currency. Do you think the Fed will ever be digitized?
I think that's one of the main things we're going to see if these things can continue to exist. And I think there can be some things that will happen to stop them. But if we can continue to keep the system going, we're going to see the free market for transparency push government to become not just transparent, but fully 100% from point A to point B transparent. That's going to change every single bit of government. It's going to change the idea of corruption. Right, we're going to go, oh, remember when you could do corruption, right? I'm Sicilian, right? We like what corruption brings, right? But the ability to provide full transparency is we really have to think about, okay, the government's going to want to regulate Bitcoin, but Bitcoin's going to regulate government, period.
Great. Thanks so much, James.